Good morning, good afternoon, good evening.
안녕하십니까, 여러분?
Welcome to PyeongChang Peace Forum.
평창 평화 포럼에 오신 여러분을 환영합니다. 본
common
세션은
agenda,
UN
peace,
우리 공동의
SDGs,
의제 보고서와
sustainable
평화에 대한
development
파트너
goals. My name is
세션 세
Untitled
번째입니다.
I'm the moderator
저는
of this
이성훈
session
대표이고요.
and also
본 세션의 좌장을
coordinator of
맡겠습니다.
Asian Civil
현재
Society
아시아
Partnership for
지속
Sustainable
가능 발전
Development,
시민사회
which is one of the
파트너십의
facilitating organizations.
대표를 맡고
This
있습니다.
session is to address
본
our
파트너
common
세션
agenda,
3에서는
OCA,
OCA 혹은 오카 보고서라고 불리우는 보고서에 대한 말씀을 나누고자 합니다. 2021년 9월 유엔 총회에 제출된 유엔 사무총장의 오카 보고서인데요.
global civil society to engage in various global issues which are interconnected and mutually reinforcing, such as SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. As you know, OCA report is a main follow-up action plan to UN Declaration on commemoration of UN 75th anniversary in 2020, which has a strong implication and impact on SDG and peace globally and locally. So this session is to seek ways and means of engagement for multi-stakeholder partnerships on OCA report and SDG in terms of peace, in line with the PyeongChang Message for Peace 2020, what we call today, according to the word of UN Secretary General in his congratulatory message, PyeongChang Peace Spirit, which is the outcome of the discussion on the previous sessions. So this session is organized in partnership with the C4UN, which is a new global civil society coalition, as we see in the banner. Coalition for the UN We Need, and also Congo Conference of NGOs in consultative status with the UN, and Civicus and A4SD, Action for Sustainable Development. Without further ado, first, let me introduce today's program. First, we will watch the UN video about OCA report, is formal promotion material. And then we have one keynote speech, as you see in the program, and also 4 panelists. So I will introduce them one by one before they speak. So let's watch the promotion material about OCA report, please. Okay, thank you very much. You can find more details about OCA report in the UN website. Now, I'd like to inform you in advance. At the end of presentation, there's a time for Q&A, and you can put your question. Those who are watching through YouTube, you can put your question in the chatting room, and also those who are present in the room, you have also a chance to raise a question, okay, speak, so that you can raise up your hand and then I'll give you floor, okay? So that I want to make it more participatory and interactive as much as possible. And all the 5 speakers, as you see in the program, they are participating virtually, unfortunately, because of coronavirus. They cannot come in person. I hope to see them next year, when Corona is over. So I'd like to invite, and some of them couldn't make it in real time because of time difference. As you know, now here is 3 o'clock, around 3 o'clock, and New York is midnight or early morning, you know. So some of them send us the pre-recorded message, which means they cannot join the Q&A session. So just for information. Let's begin with the first keynote speaker. As we see in the program, Maria Ferendez Espinoza. We invite her because she was the former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ecuador, but more importantly, she was the President of UN General Assembly year 2020. She was one of the key leaders to lead this declaration on the UN 75, and also she is now the GWL, Global Women Leaders Voice, which is a coalition of global women leaders for inclusion and social change. So she sent us the special keynote address in pre-recorded messages. Let's watch it and listen to her now.
Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to start by thanking the PyeongChang Peace Forum for bringing us together, especially Anselmo Lee and his very able team. We gather today to discuss a very critical issue, and we need to answer a very important question. Is the United Nations fit for purpose? Is it responding to the current threats to our human security? The short answer is yes. But after 76 years, the organization needs to be rejuvenated, and we have a golden opportunity to do so. Last September, the UN Secretary General launched the report called Our Common Agenda, the OCA, which was the result of a mandate contained in the political declaration adopted by all member states for the commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. I have to say that amidst an adverse social, economic, and political context marked by the impact of simultaneous and interconnected global crises, the OCA provides a roadmap and a set of recommendations to improve the UN's efficiency and effectiveness and bolster its role as the center of gravity of multilateralism and the scaffold, the platform to unleash collective and concerted action for building greener, more equal, safer, and peaceful future. Our common agenda has 5 main objectives, but today I would like to discuss mainly those related to the Sustainable Development Goals, the 2030 Agenda, and the participation of civil society. One of the key objectives of the OCA is to accelerate the achievement of the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs by renewing the social contract between governments and citizens, rebuilding trust and social cohesion, and embracing a comprehensive vision of human rights. In addition, the OCA seeks to ensure the meaningful participation of civil society, citizens, women, and young people in decision-making through genuine intergenerational dialogue and co-responsibility with the generations to come. And for that to happen, there is an urgent need to adapt and equip the United Nations so it responds to current challenges in delivering the public goods that the world needs. And there are specific recommendations in the report. For example, the appointment of a special envoy for future generations to represent the interests of those who are to be born over the coming century, and supports the multilateral system work on prospective thinking. This position will complement the Futures Lab, where the UN will conduct future impact assessments of central policies and programs and strengthen the system and country strategic foresight, preparedness for catastrophic risks, and anticipatory decision-making. It also calls for the upgrading of the special mandate on youth to a dedicated UN Youth Office in the Secretariat, which will continue to lead high-level advocacy and serve as the anchor for the United Nations systems coordination and accountability on youth matters across the work on peace, sustainable development, humanitarian issues, and human rights. And third, a high-level advisory board led by former heads of state and government, which will be co-chaired by the former president of Liberia, Helen Johnson-Sirleaf, and former Swedish Prime Minister Stefan Löfven. The board is requested to identify global public goods and other areas of common interest where governance improvements are most needed and propose alternatives for how this could be achieved. And fourth, a new agenda for peace to reduce strategic risks such as cyber warfare and autonomous weapons, the peaceful use of outer space, improve collective responses to all forms of violence, enhance prevention and peace-building capacities, and advance the women, peace, and security agenda. And of course, to make significant progress in the disarmament agenda. And number 5, a repurposed trusteeship council that will work as a multi-stakeholder body to tackle emerging challenges and primarily to serve as a deliberative forum to act on behalf of succeeding generations. To advance these objectives, the OCA envisions a series of summits, the 2023 Summit of the Future, the biennial summits related to global economic governance, and the 2025 World Social Summit. To be impactful and with tangible and action-oriented results, these summits need the full engagement of governments and leaders from all sectors. Allow me to highlight the importance of ownership, of participation, of truly crafting renewed narratives, renewed commitments, renewed resolve to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, to reach the Paris Agreement climate goals, and to restore trust among citizens, governments, and international institutions, including the United Nations. We have followed and heard leaders in so many summits. However, we have now the opportunity to make them count, to use the process, the countdown to 2023 and 2025 as platforms for collective dialogue and prospective thinking that will ensure that this new social contract or contracts will really happen. And allow me to emphasize that the construction of a new social contract, a new path for the future, cannot be crafted by a selected few. We need a whole of society approach. To reimagine and reshape the future needs all of us. And to close, I can say that we cannot miss the opportunity provided by our common agenda. A consultation and dialogue process has started under the leadership of the current president of the UN General Assembly. Civil society organizations are profusely discussing, building, proposing ideas around the implementation of the OCA. The coalition of the UN We Need, that I have the privilege to co-chair, brings together civil society organizations from all regions of the world, from grassroots to academia and think tanks, actively engaging in this global conversation about the UN for the 21st century, or what we call a multilateral system 2.0. This is the responsible thing to do in this moment of inflection in world history. We need answers, we need solutions. The UN is a human-made organization and not a self-operating machine. We all have a role to play. Pessimism is a luxury that we cannot afford, and indifference is not an option in times of crisis. I thank you all for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Maria, for your very concise, insightful presentation about OCA report itself and also its implication, and particularly the challenges for our engagement. Here there are about 20-30 participants in the room. Let me ask you, are you a member of this coalition for UN We Need? Anybody? Please raise up your hand. Is it first time you heard of this one, the coalition? This is exactly one of the reasons that we organized this session to introduce coalition for the UN we need. And then you are more than welcome to join this coalition. You can go to website. You can put keyword, the coalition for the UN we need. And then there is a space for participation members. You are all can become the member of this coalition after this. So that next year when I ask the same question, everybody should be able to raise up your hand, okay? So that's why it's the true meaning of the coalition. You know, this is our common agenda. We need to ask ourselves before we go to the panelists, do we belong to ours? Is it our common agenda? Is it our agenda is a part of this common? Can this agenda be translated into concrete action with a real impact on the ground? I think these are some key questions we need to address while we are listening to the panelists. So let's begin the panel discussion. As you see, as the Ambassador Maria said, you know, there are a series of opportunities, right? Do you remember? 2023, 2022, 3, 4, 5, right? This year we have a Transforming Education Summit in September. Next year, Summit of the Future, which means about youth, next generation, and 2025 Social Summit. So there is a very clear roadmap about this our common agenda, which we'll discuss more in detail with the panelists. We have 5 panelists. You might be wondering, what is the order of these 5 panelists? Can anybody guess? Why Congo first, Civicus, A4SD, and then Coalition for the UN we need, and the last one, PyeongChang Youth Ambassador of 2022, who was selected only last week through this YPC, PyeongChang Youth Peace Challenge. This is the order of foundation. First, Congo is one of the oldest international NGO born with the UN, 1946. And then Civicus, 1990, 30 years ago. Then the A4SD, which was created right after 2015 when SDG was adopted, you know. And then Coalition for the UN after this year 2020. So this is the order, okay? So we will listen to these 5 experts from the international NGOs. How do they see our common agenda in terms of civil society engagement in the implementation of SDG and peace? So Cyril, good morning, good afternoon. You are speaking from Geneva, or which part of Europe are you in now? Unmute, please.
Yeah, I'm in Geneva.
Okay, Geneva. Okay, bonjour. And then second speaker, the David. God, hello. Where are you from? Where are you now? You are in Johannesburg?
Yes, a very warm Johannesburg, South Africa.
Okay, good. Then we have Oli, see it's not. And then Nudara, hello. Where are you now?
Hi, Anselmo. I'm actually in New York now.
Oh my
I'm usually
God.
in India, but I'm in New York.
New York. It must be early in the morning. I'm so sorry. And thank you for participating in the difficult time
No
zone.
problem at all.
And then we have a last speaker, the winner of PyeongChang Youth Challenge Program, Denisa. Hello. Where are you now?
Hi Anselmo, I'm in Jakarta, Indonesia.
Okay, so these are truly global dialogue with the 4 panelists at the moment. Let me invite Cyril Rich to give us your idea or response to this OCA report and also Maria presentation. So you have about 10 minutes, please, Cyril.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator, my dear friend Anselmo. What a pleasure to follow the inspiring Maria. The Conference of NGOs in Consultative Relationship with the United Nations, known universally as Congo, was founded in 1948. It thus has 74 years of intense experience of interacting with the entire United Nations system, of upholding the values and aspirations set out in the UN Charter, and of advocating expertly, systematically, and consistently for the inclusion of NGO and broader civil society voices and competences in the deliberative processes of all United Nations agencies, commissions, units, and entities. This reference to Congo's knowledge of and engagement with the entire UN system is of direct relevance to a discussion of turning the UN Secretary General's excellent report, Our Common Agenda, into reality. OCA has reverberations throughout every UN agency and entity, both at the intergovernmental decision-making level and at the level of implementation of UN declarations, compacts, and programs. OCA is a major contribution to pushing forward the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, themselves an agenda for the world, requiring unremitting involvement of governments, of civil society, of academic and scientific constituencies, of the private sector, indeed, of citizens everywhere. This is the nub of Congo's concern on the implementation of UN values, goals, aspirations, and decisions. The UN's words, whether in conventions, General Assembly or specialized agency resolutions, or reports of the Secretary General, the UN words are most often precise, encompassing, even inspiring. However, translating those words into action often leaves much to be desired. The political courage to implement both intergovernmental decisions and the challenges laid before governments by the Secretary General is too often lacking or diluted. Why is this so? And what is needed to achieve better results in implementing both OCA and, more broadly, the SDGs? Two blockages need to be mentioned. Firstly, implementation is first and foremost an obligation of government at the national level. And we are too often confronted with governmental short-termism. Ministers' eyes are too often focused on the next election rather than the needs of future generations. Second consideration, governments do not adequately consult civil society organizations whose grassroots experience and constituencies can contribute much needed competence and energy to all phases of the implementation process. Civil society organizations bring to the table the knowledge of what citizens need to improve their lives in terms of, and I simply quote some of the OCA chapter headings, in terms of social contracts and protection, education, youth engagement, gender equality, job creation, access to justice, to health and to peace, and of course, to environmental and economic sustainability. It should be the bounden duty of intergovernmental bodies and national governments to foster and expand the participation of civil society in the implementation of what is so rightly entitled Our Common Agenda. There is, however, a further and very serious matter affecting the implementation of OCA and the SDGs. Not only do governments neglect to adequately consult civil society, but too many are increasingly restricting civic space, not only thereby harming their own effectiveness, but reducing channels for citizens to exercise their democratic responsibilities. The aspirations of our common agenda will be frustrated where governments imprison human rights defenders and investigative journalists, where governments abuse the rule of law and undermine the independence of the judiciary, and where governments derail democracy in an attempt to retain unfettered power. Our common agenda is, of course, not a perfect document, but it is a clarion call from the UN Secretary General for action to move the world forward, to prepare a better future for its people. Climate chaos, earthquakes, pandemics, cyber attacks, migrations are not constrained by borders. Therefore, they need reinvigorated multilateral responses and funding. Let us strive unremittingly towards much greater understanding and cooperation between governments and civil society organizations, mobilizing the energies of all to achieve the world we want and the new UN we need. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Cecil, for your also very concise and insightful presentation. I'd like to highlight a few keywords in your word of presentation: the civic space, consultation with the civil society. I like the last few words: the world we want, the UN we need. So how we can create the world we want? How we can make a UN what we need? Okay, thank you for your input. I hope you stay with us for Q&A session since it's the morning. Now from Geneva, let's travel to all the way down to South Africa, Johannesburg. It must be in the morning, David, right? Okay, David, maybe you can introduce briefly the Civicus. Not everybody knows about Civicus. It's a good opportunity to introduce Civicus. And then you can make your presentation, 10 minutes. Thank you. David, please.
Thank you so much, Anselmo. Thank you so much to your team as well for inviting us to participate in this very important forum. And thanks to the participants. Yes, all the way from Johannesburg, South Africa, and it's 9 o'clock in the morning. So the right time for us to be engaging in these kind of crucial discussions. I just had coffee, so I'm very alert this morning. So I work for an organization called Civicus, which is a global alliance of civil society organizations. We have members in over 170 countries at the moment, and our membership strength is above 11,000. And our members range from formal civil society organizations, trade unions, individuals, activists, human rights defenders, and so on and so forth. Our core mandate is on civic space. That is, we protect the rights to freedom of assembly, association, and expression. We consider the strategy, the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly SDG 16, as a rallying point for civil society. My presentation this morning will look at some of the challenges that we have observed as far as global governance is concerned, or the United Nations, and then we'll look at some of the key issues that have been raised in the OCA report, and we'll look at the issue of civic space. The second speaker from Geneva really talked about the issue of civic space, and that's Civicus's mandate. We'll look at how civic space can either improve on the objectives of the OCA report or the SDGs in general, and what are some of the key challenges posed by civic space. And of course, I'll conclude with a set of recommendations on the way forward. Like many civil society groups, we really welcome the OCA report because it addressed most of the key issues that civil society has been calling for. With the report and with the Sustainable Development Goals, and of course the global summit that is coming up, we think that we have enough content, enough agreements to be able to work together to implement them effectively without necessarily developing new agreements. In other words, if all of us, as the OCA report says, our common agenda, if we collectively implement the recommendations and the issues that have been raised by the report, and if we implement the recommendations and all the sustainable development goals in real time, we will not need another agreement because there's a lot that is contained in these that will address some of the basic challenges that we face. The United Nations, in its preamble, starts with "we the people." The OCA report talks about our common agenda, but more often than not, we see a gap between the people, governments, and key institutions like the United Nations that are supposed to represent the people. The United Nations is kind of state-centric. There's still a lot of attention placed on states, the priorities of states, and the discussions that happen around states. And sometimes we, the people, are excluded from some of these processes or discussions. So I'll kick off my presentation with some key concerns that we have with global governance or with the United Nations in particular. And my presentation is based on 10 years of research and analysis and engagements with key decision makers, including the United Nations. We feel that when it comes to the United Nations, there's a failure on big issues. So big issues related to climate justice, climate change, big issues related to some of the most perverse conflicts that we see across the world. The people are often left at the bottom of some of these key decision-making processes. We have not comprehensively, as a global community, particularly the United Nations, prioritized and followed up on issues related to climate justice. Conflicts in Afghanistan, Cameroon, Syria, Yemen, and now Ukraine continue to simmer, yet we don't see an acute prioritization of these big issues that ultimately affects the Sustainable Development Goals. Because if there's conflict, the rights of girls are affected, they can't go to school. If there's conflict, the rights of children are affected. If there's conflict, citizens cannot participate. Yet the United Nations, despite the progress that has been made over the last 76 years, has not really prioritized or addressed most of these big issues. We are also looking at an institution that is due for reform. At the founding of the United Nations, there were 51 states. At the moment, the United Nations has about 193 members. The geopolitical dynamics across the globe has changed from the time when the United Nations was formed. There are countries that play a major role in the international community and international affairs, like Canada, like South Korea. And there are also emerging countries like South Africa, like Brazil, like India, like Indonesia, that are supposed to have a more prominent role in a reformed United Nations. The Security Council is still made up of 5 permanent members, the same members that were there at the inception of the United Nations. So there's need for reform. The United Nations and its institutions are also deadlocked by states. There's also a complexity and gaps in participation. The United Nations, quite frankly, has been able to spread its tentacles in different countries across the world. In almost every region, you have a regional office of the United Nations, a Commission on Human Rights. You have the United Nations Development Program and all its institutions as a means of bringing these institutions closer to the people. But in many instances, this remains theory. many people do not access the United Nations because of the complexities. There are also perceptions, and the United Nations as an institution through its regional and national offices needs to be demystified to allow access of people, not just people, but communities. There's also a lack of accountability from the invasion of Iraq in the early 2000s to some of the decisions that are being made at the Security Council, to even staff of the United Nations in country offices, including the DRC and Haiti, where they themselves are perpetrators of human rights violations or attacks on vulnerable groups. And yet there's no accountability when this happens, or little accountability. There's still the democratic deficit, where the big states or the big five still have their say, and where powerful nations often block attempts at peacekeeping and peacemaking or access to the United Nations to suit their own personal, political, economic, and geostrategic interests. The private sector has more privilege in the United Nations than even civil society. In terms of decision-making, we're not just talking about access to the table, we're talking about access to key decisions that affect all of us. The private sector is prioritized, followed by government, or the government and the private sector, and civil society is also is always at the end of the queue. So with these challenges, we welcome the OCA and the priority that it gives to civil society, but also that it opens up participation of the United Nations to many groups that would otherwise not be able to participate. But the OCA is not the first novel report that really addresses some of the concerns of civil society and citizens. There have been reports before that. Many of such reports are gathering dust and have not been implemented. Let us be that generation that would take the recommendations of the OCA beyond the words that are printed on the document. Let us be that generation that makes a difference for the generations to come. One of the calls from civil society that is mentioned or addressed in the OCA is the call for a civil society envoy at the United Nations. We should move beyond rhetoric and appoint that envoy who will represent the interests of civil society groups. The Summit for the Future is also a crucial opportunity for us to engage. We should be able to invite civil society, a diverse range of civil society organizations. I speak from a privileged position in Johannesburg, the economic capital of South Africa, and from a privileged position of an international organization, as Anselmo mentioned, that was created in 1993. More often than not, we have access to the United Nations as civicals. We have an office in New York, we have an office in Geneva, we have an office in London, and we are able, with the resources that we have, to make the necessary connections. But the summit should look beyond organizations like civicals and engage with grassroots and community-led groups that are actually affected by many of the decisions that are made. We should also say we have several allies in the United Nations, from Denmark to Sweden, Norway to the Netherlands, that have prioritized human rights in their foreign policy. And as civicals, we bear testimony to the actions of some of these states when human rights are violated at national level, but also the importance that some of these countries place in resolutions at the Human Rights Council, in resolutions at the United Nations, where they try as much as possible to prioritize human rights. We see these countries as allies. Human rights defenders see them as allies. Civil society sees them as allies. And we are calling on them to continue to raise concerns and to prioritize calls for access to civil society to these platforms, but also the importance or the urgency in appointing a UN envoy for civil society. There's another part of my presentation that looks at civic space and the challenges that it poses to global governance, but also to participation of citizens at national and global level. For example, civil society representatives are often, or sometimes in many countries, prevented from traveling to the UN, either because their governments do not want them to raise concerns about human rights in their particular countries, or even the bureaucratic nature of the United Nations makes it difficult. We have the CSW, Commission on the Status of Women, happening in March. We have International Women's Day happening in March. But more often than not, we get complaints from our grassroots partners that they are denied visas to be able to participate in this forum. So we need to think about ways in which we move beyond rhetoric. The OCA report is welcome, has so much to offer us. Let us be that generation that takes the theory and the suggestions and the recommendations and practicalize them so that we can indeed make a difference for the generations to come. There are other aspects of my presentation that looks at the state of civic space across the world and certain recommendations on how those can be addressed. But I'm mindful of time, and I'd like to stop here for now and then hope to engage with participants in the question and answer session. Thank you so much for this opportunity, and I look forward to the other presentations, but also to the session where we'll engage and answer any questions that participants may have. Over to you, Anselmo.
Okay, thank you, David, for again very concise and insightful presentation. Let's give a big hands to David. And if I were asked to summarize in 3 keywords, I would choose "We the Peoples." First 3 words, UN Charter you mentioned. Number 2, UN reform and the CSO envoy. According to OCA report, the CSO envoy should be appointed. Last one is a democratic deficit and also role of democratic government. You mentioned several, including South Korea. In fact, this PyeongChang Peace Forum is another effort of Korean government, particularly local government, to create a space for international solidarity on all those issues. Thank you once again. Due to time constraint, he wasn't able to finish the rest of his PowerPoint. He mentioned Civic Space Monitoring Report. So if you go to Civicus website, very simple, civicus.org, you can find the global monitoring site of the situation of civic space, or all, I think over 170 countries. So thank you once again. Let's go to the third speaker. So let me present Oli from A4SD. He's now in the screen. As I said in the beginning, this is the order of the chronological order foundation. First one, Congo. He shared over 70-year wisdom of activism, civil society, and the Civicus 30 years of wisdom. But this A4SD relatively, he doesn't look very young, but it's a relatively young A4SD. It's only 5, 6, 7 years old. As I said, he was born 1916, right after 2030 agenda. And he used to work for Civicus before. So let's have a very fresh, energetic presentation about what is this A4SD for and how he has been reviewing this OCA agenda in terms of action. So now let's travel from all the way from Johannesburg to back to Europe, now London. Only you have 10 minutes, please.
Thank you so much, Anselmo. It's wonderful to join you and to join colleagues who I know well. Yeah, my cat just joined us there. I hope you were able to see him briefly. It's wonderful to join you all, and it's fantastic to follow David, who, as you say, I used to work with Civicus, and it's wonderful to see David again. So it's great to be able to follow on from so much of what David has said. I think we are at a critical juncture, as you've already heard, and we are facing such a moment of transition. And I think I share some of the demands that David has already highlighted in terms of how to make the most of this moment and ensure that the UN does indeed become a more open and accountable system. So as you've mentioned, Anselmo, Action for Sustainable Development came out of joint campaigning in 2015 on the Sustainable Development Goals and what became the 2030 Agenda. We act as a kind of coalition of community-based organizations all around the world that have an interest in sustainable development. More than 3,000 groups involved now all around the world. And each year we tend to follow the cycle of the reporting that is linked to the voluntary national reviews and the high-level political forum on the SDGs. But today I'm going to try and draw out a few additional ideas on our common agenda and how many of our members and partners see the opportunities and the importance of change. So if I can also share my screen, I'm just going to put it onto a slideshow view there. So yeah, thinking about our common agenda, we do generally also participate in the key meetings around the UN General Assembly in September. I've been there for a number of the years before the lockdown hit, and we're very aware that there are opportunities and also demands that come from across a range of different partners in civil society in order to open up the UN process. So here are just a few of those demands, and I think David's already touched on this, but I just thought I would try to bring them together in one place to give us a few of the main areas that have been highlighted. So one of those that David was just going through and that many of us have pushed for several years is around the idea of a civil society focal point or envoy who would act as an entry point across all UN agencies. Because I think what we see now through the Sustainable Development Agenda, for example, is that different countries will react in different ways to civil society. Different UN agencies have different processes. So we see one type of process at the high-level political forum on sustainable development. We see a different kind of process on the UN Environment Programme and UNEA, the Environmental Assembly, which will be meeting soon. We see a different process at CSW, the Commission on the Status of Women. We see a different process during the UN General Assembly. So there's very little accountability, but there's also very little standardization across the different UN processes. Of course, there's the Human Rights Council, which I know Civicus follows in very closely, and the UPR process, but we don't see the same approaches to civil society across the UN. So having a focal point or an envoy would allow a kind of raising of the bar across all the UN agencies to ensure that those methods and mechanisms for civil society participation are recognized across the board. And we really share that demand that David has already highlighted. Secondly, I think what that would allow for is a more accessible process, clearer engagement, a more meaningful engagement. So it's not just a tick box. I mean, I have to say, I was a little bit disappointed just in these last few weeks. The president of the General Assembly has been hosting these 5 consultations on our common agenda, but the deadlines were incredibly short. And so it makes it very hard for those who are based in other parts of the world, as David has already said, to be able to engage with that process. They were given about 10 days to come up with an opportunity to input into the Our Common Agenda dialogues. The actual way of participating is very limited at the moment. It's mainly on a kind of broadcast format where you don't have an opportunity, for example, to fill in a survey, to give views through other ways. You have to be online at that particular time. And if your internet connection isn't strong enough, then you can't participate. So there are some big gaps still around how to ensure meaningful engagement, not just a kind of tick box exercise. And then the digital side, and this is something that's come up also because of the lockdowns and because of the COVID restrictions, thinking about how to improve digital inclusion. And we do need to think differently about how that's done. It can't just be through these kind of broadcast formats where you hear from a UN representative, but you don't have a real opportunity for exchange. And often, as I said before, digital connectivity can be an issue. We did have some good experience on that last year during the high-level political forum, where the UN office in Angola actually provided the connection for a young person who wanted to engage with the HLPF. When Angola had its VNR, he was able to engage through the UN office. So perhaps UN offices themselves can provide that connectivity. And then finally, I've mentioned here, and this is one thing that is in the Our Common Agenda, is that each agency should also have its focal point. And some of those work better than others. And again, we'd like to see more of a connection between the different focal points in UNDP, in OHCHR, in UNDESA, and so on, to make sure that there's a clearer connection across the different UN agencies. So moving on, a few of the things that have come up, a few of the recommendations and insights that have come up from some of our members on the response to the pandemic and leaving no one behind, which I think really should frame how the UN now moves forward, because we have had such a moment of intense change and such a moment of the pandemic has led to such massive disruption that we now need to rethink things, not just within the UN, but how the UN operates and connects with other levels of government. So one of the things that has come up, of course, is the access to healthcare. We think there needs to be a seismic shift towards universal healthcare. The WHO has been active on this, but again, many countries need to go further with embedding real access to universal healthcare and social protection. Secondly, in order to pay for some of these additional needs on health and social protection, we think that national debts need to be cancelled, particularly for those low and middle income countries that have been struggling and that will face an economic challenge now in part of the recovery. This has been raised many times, and governments in the global north, the countries that hold those debts, are still reluctant to actually cancel those debts. And we think that this is a question of justice, as David has said, that really it's essential that every country should be able to take care of its own people and not have to prioritize paying debts at a time of such a catastrophic situation. And then thirdly, when new funding does become available, that funding needs to go directly to local communities to ensure we leave no one behind. Unfortunately, time and again with international assistance and ODA, that money is somehow lost in the machinery of government and doesn't actually reach the frontline communities who are facing significant challenges. So when new funding is available, it does need to go through more innovative channels to actually reach communities directly. I've also got a couple of points here more directly related to sustainability. So, for example, halting deforestation. That's something that does have an impact on the pandemic, because so much of what we've seen now with these diseases comes from the reduction of space for nature. And so we're going further and further into natural spaces and therefore unleashing also other diseases. And for the future of the planet, it's essential now that we do protect biodiversity. And then finally, the recovery is an opportunity for the green revolution, if you like, a rapid scaling up of sustainable jobs. Any incentives, any stimulus packages that are agreed as part of the recovery must guarantee a green industrial revolution that also prioritizes women, a feminist green industrial revolution. So I also wanted to touch for a minute or two on peace and justice, because I know this was the theme of your question, although I can't say that we as A4SD, this is not our main area of work, but we do, of course, within our networks have those who focus on Goal 16. So I just have a couple of ideas here for you around the sort of peace and justice side. One of the things that's mentioned in our common agenda is the need to invest in prevention and peace building and reduce strategic risks. And I think in a time now where we're seeing increased militarization, particularly in Ukraine, which has already been mentioned, we do need to see a real shift towards peace building and recognizing the importance of working together as an international community, that multilateral approach that seems to be under threat. A global roadmap for the development of implementation of international law. So this ties in much more closely with Goal 16, ensuring that some of those agreements that have been made, like the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, that they are actually delivered and implemented. And again, throughout all of this, highlighting the importance of gender equality and putting women and girls at the center. We know that so much of the violence that we see in conflict situations is directed towards women, and they're at a particular risk. So it's really essential that as part of those peace-building strategies that women and girls are given particular protections. So this is really essential given the huge militarization that we're seeing, and we really encourage all countries to step back. And then finally, I wanted to come back to the SDGs agenda. And of course, this is also mentioned in our common agenda, that we are in the decade, as they say, the decade of action, the decade that must deliver the Sustainable Development Goals. So what are some of the key issues in order to ensure that we do deliver within this coming remaining years of the decade? So one of those points must be solidarity on vaccines. We did see huge demands for a people's vaccine to ensure that countries that need it most were able to receive free doses of the vaccine, and indeed to break the patents so that countries like South Africa could make their own vaccines. They have the technology, they have the ability, they just need access to the actual ingredients, if you like, the know-how to then be able to go ahead and make their own vaccines. This would be a much fairer approach for so many countries that are still facing huge impacts from the pandemic. Secondly, we do think that there is a significant risk now from the pandemic on some of those key goals that focus on health, education, and even on poverty eradication. At the last HLPF in July, I did hear a number of governments starting to say, is it even still possible to deliver what they agreed to in the SDGs, and highlighting that because of the pandemic, some of those goals are becoming further from achievability. And I think it's essential that we keep the pressure up to say, these are the goals that were agreed. These are the steps that need to be taken. We need to work together to ensure that they do happen. And finally, in order to make that happen, again, it comes back to financing. We need to guarantee adequate financing. And I don't think that the Secretary General's report talks enough about the financing of these goals and of the wider agenda that he's set out. That is still a big gap. And the clock is ticking, as I've said on the presentation here. So we do need to see robust action. The previous round of discussions around Addis Ababa on financing seemed to kind of end up not resolving anything. Similarly, in the COP discussions in Glasgow last year, the financing was much less than what has been agreed and is needed. So we really need to see governments now stepping up, and this requires big donors, whether it's the US, whether it's the European Union, some of those key donors, to actually put some real financing on the table to deliver on these goals. So I think those are my main points I wanted to highlight, Anselmo, and it's really wonderful to be able to join, and I look forward to continuing the conversation both on this call and over the coming months, and hopefully we'll be able to meet again in person at some point this year. Thank you so much.
Okay, let's give a big hands to Oli. It must be early in the morning. Else, thank you for bringing your cat. So this is not only the human being, also with the animals. Okay. So let me put the three keywords. You mentioned about, again, envoy, the focal point for youth, for UN. And second one is digital divide and digital inclusion. I think it's very, very important. Number three, I would say the militarization and peace building. This morning, we had a very sad news about the Russian invasion into part of Ukraine. So this is a reality today. We are, especially in PyeongChang, Ukraine is far from here, but this is not really far from the story. This is a reality we are facing today in this Korean Peninsula. Okay, thank you very much once again. Okay, let's go to we have two more speakers. In fact, it's not only the order of the chronological order foundation, but also intergenerational dialogue. First three speakers, at least they have a more than 10-year experience of civil society activism. Now we have a relatively fresh, young activist who can share their view about this OCA report. Nudara, so I hope you are still awake in New York. So you have also 10 minutes. Okay, could you please share your view about this OCA, also response to previous speakers?
Thank you so much, and Salma, and thank you to all the previous speakers for your wisdom, knowledge, and insights on the OCA report and the kind of path going forward. And I think all of you spoke a lot as well to the processes going forward. So I'm going to touch a little bit on the idea of the new agenda for peace that's coming up in the OCA report, the role of young people in taking forth this agenda, but also by and large civil society, and try to do this a little bit of justice to the extent that I can in 10 minutes. So the first thing to say, I think, is when you talk about the new agenda for peace, which is a recommendation in Our Common Agenda report, which are the OCA, it's a big idea, it's a new idea, and there's a lot of kind of abstract thinking that needs to go around this area. And so I think civil society has the opportunity to play a key role here, because while several recommendations build straight off SDG goals, for example, job creation for youth or quality education, a new agenda for peace is a little bit abstract. And so civil society has the space here to come in and define what a new agenda for peace could look like. And these are the types of roles that I think, especially given the PGA dialogues have made it somewhat clear that this is going to be a member state driven process. Civil society needs to find the vehicles that it can to influence this agenda and to influence this process. And I think the new agenda for peace is a particular one. So to this extent, the Coalition for the UN We Need had some expert dialogues, a series of expert dialogues that align with the thematic clusters of PGA dialogues that Ollie mentioned previously. And when we discussed the new agenda for peace, there were some legitimate questions regarding the utility and value added of redefining the agenda. The UN has had many agendas in peace and security: the sustaining peace agenda, the security agenda, the women in peace and security agenda, children peace and security agenda. What has often failed is implementation. Any new agenda for peace needs to improve early warning and localize action that will support peaceful outcomes. Redefining the agenda at the global scale is all well and good, but unless it trickles down, or is rather not just trickled down, but implemented fundamentally at the grassroots level, it's not going to have the impacts that the global community calls for. And so the OCA needs to be used as a vehicle to improve the UN's response architecture, but also its reach at the grassroots level. Having said this, peace as a global public good may provide some inception points for inclusive peace building processes. So defining peace as a global public good will allow it to go beyond the definition of a military. And peace building is too often channeled through governments. And most often it's when you involve people at the local level, especially young people at kind of your local country and national levels, people that are directly affected by these conflicts, that you're going to see sustainable outcomes for the future. And so more and more we need to start thinking about what peace means as a global value, and as kind of going beyond the definition of just military and through governments. And so to this extent, I'm going to talk very briefly, because I do also want to go on to I'm looking forward to the discussion ahead about the role of youth in peace building. Most often, it is youth that are involved in conflict and affected by conflict as the majority proportion of the people affected. But they also provide an entry point for defining peace as a global public good beyond this kind of military definition. It is disenfranchised young people that most often get caught in conflict. And so in this sense, investing in education, investing in job creation, SDG 8, looking at youth empowerment, and also things like the research that's been done through the Our Future Agenda report by the Next Generation Youth Fellows, the UN Youth Envoy, the Youth 2030 program, all provide avenues for empowering young people at the local level so that they're prevented from going into kind of disenfranchisement and therefore through conflict. So elevating youth from conflict traps within itself provides the intersectional policy grounds required to start defining youth as a global public good beyond military definitions. And so we hope that these kind of intersections will be picked up on by the high-level advisory board that Maria Ferendez Espinoza mentioned at the very beginning, and especially in their report that's going to lead into the Summit of the Future in 2023. Secondly, at the global level, now, Our Common Agenda report also calls for a UN Youth Office to be established. And as young people in general, we see this having two key roles, an inward-facing role and an outward-facing role. In the inward-facing role, we think of the UN Youth Office to have an integration mandate. See, young people are all different. I'm slightly different to the next young kind of YPC ambassador that's going to be speaking, and the young people in South Korea are different to the young people in another country, but equally, youth advocates are different to youth ambassadors and civil society representatives of youth. And so we see the UN Youth Office as having a mandate of integration to bring together the work that young people are doing across the board and have them reflected in decision-making, not just conversations that happen at the UN. The second is an outward-facing role for the Youth Office. So when you think of things like the Our Common Agenda report or the Sustainable Development Goals or the Paris Agreement or the Youth 2030 program, oftentimes as a young person, a job market that doesn't really exist, or graduating from universities on Zoom because they aren't open or not able to go to school, they don't really have time to look at the global agenda, digest it, and see what they need to do for it. So we see the role of the UN Youth Office as also being a translator, or rather an interpreter of the agenda at hand, to create clear, succinct, understandable action items that young people can engage with to achieve multiple global agendas, including the peace agenda, in kind of distinct accelerated points of action. And part of this comes from using existing communication channels. Young people have the capability to make things go viral overnight. So surely there are ways to engage with masses quickly and efficiently. Listen, the Our Common Agenda report presents potential, but the decisions we make now, the institutional structures we build today, will directly affect our capacity and our ability to define the UN of tomorrow, to define the generations of tomorrow. And so the seats that we bring to the table at the moment, the decisions that we make now, will directly impact the next generation of the United Nations and whether we break down or break through. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Nuda. Let's give a big hands to Suara, especially a very difficult time zone. Again, she made a very concise and insightful summary of the OCA report in terms of youth and peace. Before I invite the last speaker, I'd like to put some question in advance for all the panelists. Of course, we'll wait for the question directly from floor and then the chat room, the YouTube. The first question is, for previous speakers, you have a huge program, global program. What is the role of youth? How youth can participate more actively in your program in OCA so that the youth can have some idea how to join this global campaign in your organization? And also, this one common question, many speakers mentioned about 2023, the Summit of the Future. summit of the future. How the civil society actor, particularly youth, can participate. You have 2 more years to go, right? How, so especially the Nudhara and others, how concretely the local civil society actor youth, like it can be Korea or China or any country in the world, can participate concretely. You know? So please give us some ideas during the Q&A session. Let's go to the last but not least speaker. She's one of the youngest speaker in this panel. She was, as I said, she was selected as one of the top 10 winners of the PyeongChang Youth Challenge. We call now the PyeongChang Youth Ambassador. Denisa from Indonesia, congratulations once again. So now you also 7 to 10 minutes to share your view about OCA report and peace. Please.
Thank you so much, Anselmo, and thank you so much, everyone. It is an honor for me to speak in this very important forum. As Anselmo mentions, my name is Denisa Amelia Kaurian. I am the representative of Youth Peace Ambassador, and I'm also currently working as the Program Officer for Sustainable Development Goals at the International NGO Forum on Indonesian Development in Jakarta, Indonesia. So today, I would like to deliver 4 main points. I would like to give a little bit about youth overview. How's the condition of the youth and OCA report, even though it has been mentioned several times during these discussions. I think I will just give a highlight about OCA report and youth. Also, my experience as I participate actively in PyeongChang Youth Peace Challenge 2022, and also looking forward. Ladies and gentlemen, so I think I would like to highlight a very important statement here, that young people are key for massive political, societal, and economic shift, but many of them are living in extreme poverty, hugely affected by the pandemic, excluded from the political process. So in the context of number, right? So we are currently the largest youth population in the history, accounting for about 1.8 billion young people in the world, and 90% of us are living in the developing countries. In the context of condition of the youth, even though before COVID-19 we already acknowledge that young unemployment are 3 times higher compared to adult unemployment, but currently 1/5 of young people are not in education, employment, or training. Nearly 1 in 4 youth resided in a setting affected by armed conflict in 2016. It actually helped us. Well, it actually makes us not able to actively participate in education in a peaceful conditions. About 60% of young people said that they felt very worried or extremely worried for climate change, according to the survey by Bath University in 2021. In the context of COVID-19, it's actually getting worse. COVID-19 disrupt educations of more than 70% of youth. It is actually the largest disruption of education in the history. And in the context of youth employment again, right, it actually dropped by 8.7% compared to 3.7% for adult. So according to this data, 50% of young people are possibly subject to anxiety or depressions. A lot of us cannot fulfill the expectation of elderly, for example, and we are becoming depressed. And because of this COVID-19 pandemic, is actually make it worse. So in the context of youth and OCA reports, so the main question is whether OCA reports are actually feasible in the context of helping young people to be more actively involved in the development process. So I would like to highlight 3 points according to OCA report that the United Nations Secretary General mentions. So the first one is having a voice, learning, and prospering. In the context of having a voice, UN Secretary General mentions that he would like to create a Youth in Politics Index. I think this is very critical according to my opinion, because according to data from Youth Development Index, youth participation in politics is the only domain to record a decline, reporting a deterioration in 102 countries. So in the context of Indonesia, for example, I acknowledge several of my colleagues or my peers are able to sit in the parliament or even like in the high level government, but most of them are coming from a very wealthy family, for example, or most of them are having a family with political background. So this is something that we would like to ensure, whether these politics index are not only evidence-based advocacy, but also being follow up by recommendations and ensuring the inclusivity of young people in the politics. The second one is appointment of special envoy for future generations, as has been mentioned previously, and also dedicated United Nations Youth Office. In the context of learning, right? So they would like to mention or propose summit on transforming education in 2022. So I would like to highlight 1 point in the context of GIGA initiative. So I think this is an initiative that is very critical, especially in the COVID-19 pandemic, where there is highly unequal access on internet, for example. Even like us, even for me, like in Jakarta right now, there are also a lot of problem in terms of connectivity. It will actually getting worse if, for example, we are talking about people who are living in very vulnerable conditions, or even in rural area. In the context of prospering, I think this is very critical because United Nations Secretary General mentions that they would like to ensure there is availability of decent job that is tied to effort to transition to low carbon economic development. So I think this is very critical in the context of it is a sustainable, and it is also applicable for us as young people, because right now, especially in the COVID-19 pandemic, there is very limited job opportunities for young people. Even if there is a job opportunities, it is very difficult for us as young people to able to meet the expectations of the companies, or for example, create our own business, because there is no any social protections for young people, especially in the developing countries. So I think in one sentence, OCA aims to deepen the solidarity with young people and future generations by better political representation and by transforming education, skills training, and also lifelong learning. So what I got through PyeongChang Youth Peace Challenge 2022, right? So I read like most of the essays written by about 70-something young people, which I think is very brilliant. And I learned a lot of many point of view and expectation of young people in regard to OCA reports. Set 3 points or 3 issues that I often saw in regard to civil, political, social, economic, and cultural rights, corruptions, and also climate change. And I actually found a very interesting statement from my colleague from Kenya. So he mentions that it will depend on whether or not such initiative can also respond to wider socio-economic, cultural, and political barriers that young people face in the quest for becoming an agent of positive change, peace building, and reconciliation. So even though there are like so many recommendations and proposal given to the young people, but it's actually really important to address whether it can actually address the structural problems and the barrier young people face to participate in development. Me, myself, even though like I'm currently living in Jakarta, Indonesia, but I was born in East Kalimantan. It's actually a Borneo, the lung of the world. It actually took me for about 2 or 3 hours only to take an English lesson in the city using motorcycles. So it's actually not like that rural, but I think it's very difficult for me to access a quality education. It will actually get worse if we are talking about people or young people who are living in a very rural area where they do not have access for quality education or a quality healthcare or for example, a skill training, for example. And this is something that we need to address, whether we can actually provide the opportunity for you to express and improve themselves in a very critical way. So looking forward, I actually also put a statement from my colleague from India, and it's actually from Independent Progress Study on UNSCR. So how do we make UCA like more applicable and feasible by collaborating with young people? There are 3 points that I think is very critical here. Invest in young people capacity. We need to harness the potential of young people and through adequate funding and opportunities for young people. The second one is include. Include youth meaningfully, politically, and economically in the context of peace educations, get rid of any structural barriers. We're talking about youth, but there are actually many kind of youth with disabilities, youth as an indigenous people, and the others. So there are like so many type of youth that we need to include in our development process. The third one is partner in implementations, coalitions, policy framework, mechanism for dialogue and accountability. Lastly, I do believe that OCA report can be feasible if we are working together. So actually, I would like to highlight a statement from Jared Diamond. I think this is very critical, where he mentions the big problems facing the world today are not beyond our control. Instead, all major threats are entirely of our own making. Since we create problem, we can solve the problem. There are a lot we don't understand and that we need to understand, and there are a lot we understand but aren't doing and need to be doing. So hopefully after this forum and after all of the discussions, we can actually actively contribute to promote more peaceful and sustainable development. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Denisa. Let's give a big hands again to Denisa. Again, very concise, very concrete in number and also proposals. I want to quote also from the Nudhara previous speaker. The keyword which come to my mind was peace as a global public good. From Denisa, thank you for introducing UNSCR 2250. UN Security Council resolution adopted 2015. The resolution number is 2250. I think this is very important, but unfortunately, not many youth around the world knows about this one, you know. So SDG 1, and then for youth, additionally 2250. Thank you for highlighting this important agenda. With these 5 input, now floor is open for question, YouTube. Let me check the YouTube, whether there is any question. And as you know, we have traveled starting from Geneva, Johannesburg, London, New York, and back to Jakarta. Now it's back to PyeongChang. Here about 25 participants in the room. Since we don't have much time, I want to give only one person a floor to speak. And please identify. Let me see, how many you want to speak? Let's see the time. You are the only one at the moment. Yes, please. Can you give the mic to the speakers? Please identify yourself briefly.
Yeah, thank you for hosting this amazing forum. My name is Kang Dong-yeol from SDGs in Korea, which is Sustainable Development Solutions Network, and I'm a network manager in SDGs. And I have a question, at the same time suggestion. So obviously, last year's main keyword was climate crisis beyond the climate change, and the most important keyword was also carbon neutrality. And to achieve carbon neutrality, we should consider about the principle of CBDR, which is common but different responsibility. But I don't think that principle belongs to only in climate agenda. I think the peace agenda can adopt the CBDR principle, because you know, this morning the permanent member of Security Council country invade other country, right? So I think it is quite important to drag this agenda into the OCA or post 2030 agenda. So I think when I first saw the when I first saw the OCA agenda, the third thing was promote peace and prevent conflicts. But to achieve this agenda completely, I think this is the time to show some peer pressure to the permanent member countries of the Security Council. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you
That
very
is
much,
my point of view.
Dong-yeol. So CBDR principle, common but differentiated responsibility, which was born out of Rio 1992. How we can apply this principle in the field of peace, especially today's reality, you know? So this maybe anybody can address this question, particularly maybe Cyril, with he has a lot of knowledge and wisdom about this type of issues. I hope he can address. Of course, anybody can answer this question. Let me see any more from in the back. Anybody wants any question? If not, I will invite the panelists. Sorry, we don't have much time left, so you have to answer, or you have to make a closing remark together. 1 or 2 minutes, really maximum 2 minutes. Okay, so let me begin with maybe Cyril. You want to answer this question, CBDR, or the issue, the summit of the future, or role of youth. You can choose one of them. Okay, Cyril, you have 2 minutes to answer, and then closing remark, please.
Thank you, Anselmo. Of course, I cannot answer that question. I can make a comment on it. As you rightly say, the common but differentiated responsibility dates back a long while within the UN system, and I think it's entirely applicable in almost every area. In the ones that it was invented for, which was basically the broader development and environment areas, but also I think you're right to say it could be applied in the peace area, but also in humanitarian actions and of course in funding. But that needs perhaps a longer study than we do have time for at the moment. I want to make one other comment in the minute I have. Sometimes in the presentations, but more often in public areas and in the media, many criticisms say the UN has not succeeded in this, or the UN has not done that, or even the UN has not got visas for people to come to the headquarters. Of course, it's so easy to blame the institution, but in fact, all those defects plainly lie at the door of individual governments. It's individual governments that do not take the actions necessary. The UN Charter is clear on the responsibility of governments, and governments have signed up to it. Every member must sign up to the Charter, but then does not obey the obligations that it has itself accepted. So I would like to see less vague criticism in public media and elsewhere about the UN as such, and much more pinpointing of what individual governments do not do and do not have the courage to do. And that includes, of course, opening up far more to civil society. Over to you.
Okay, thank you. Now, David, you have also 2 minutes, please.
Thank you, Anselmo. I think in summary, there needs to be a conscious, dedicated, and sustained effort by government, by the UN, by our civil society to prioritize youth, either in the summit or in UN programs or global programs. You are setting a very good example here by bringing Denisa. We all benefited from her presentation and intervention. I think the same should be replicated in other forums at the UN. And prioritizing youth means we dedicate resources, time, effort to really tap into this vibrant set of people who have a lot to offer but have not always been given the opportunity to do so. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Now, Oli, you have 2 minutes too, please.
Thank you so much, Anselmo, and thank you again to all the colleagues. It's been a really excellent session. I wanted to pick up on the question of how can young people engage with some of our campaigns. So what I did want to mention for those who are joining us today, that we as A4SD will shortly be launching a new online space, which we're calling Zovu. And the purpose of that space is to showcase frontline stories of change makers. And there will be an opportunity there for young people and others to upload their own content, particularly short video content, to share key opportunities and ideas for how they can make change within their own communities, so we can really bring to the fore all of those who are already achieving change within their communities. And that website, we hope, will also then be able to connect crowdfunding opportunities, because we know that even a few $100 or $1,000 can make a huge difference to a small community group that's just starting off. So that website will be launching soon, within the next few months, so look out for that. And in the build-up, we'll then work together towards the Week of Action in September. And again, for those who aren't active, please do join us. It's an annual Week of Action now that we take together around the time of the UN General Assembly to raise awareness of the Sustainable Development Agenda and to really give opportunities for different voices to be heard, both at the UN and through different kind of online social media activities. So looking forward to keeping in touch with all of you over the coming months. Thanks, Anselmo.
Okay, thank you. Oli, what's the meaning of Jobu? You mentioned Jobu. Jobu?
Oh, Zovu is a word. So this came from discussions with our own members. It's a word from Togo, from the Ewe language in Togo, and it means to seek out the truth. And so we thought it was appropriate as a way to highlight those who are seeking truth in different parts of the world.
Okay, this is for Jobu, because we learn a lot of new words from Africa, from the Ubuntu. So it's another one, Jobu, you know. So these are truly global solidarity coming from global south, particularly Africa, you know. Although this is a global program, the young people can join. If you have a good idea, if you need funding, there is a possibility, right? So let's continue. Then now, the Nuduhara, could you please share these 2 minutes for your thought and then answer or comment?
Sure, Anselmo. Thank you so much. So I'll pick up on your question of how young people can be involved in the process leading up to the Summit of the Future. Largely speaking, as a young person who's trying to get involved in the process leading up to the Summit of the Future. So I think the main thing to keep in mind is Our Common Agenda report is 90 recommendations sprinkled across paragraphs. So the way to think of it is these are seeds that the Secretary General has planted for us to develop and grow into plants, trees, whatever we can make of them. So for those young people who might be sitting there with you, Anselmo, and thinking, what can I do? How can I get involved? I'd say two things. First, figure out what's already out there. So opportunities like that Ollie has just shared with you, that Coalition for the UN We Need, for example, presents opportunities. The Youth Peace Challenge that Denise has taken part in. There are several other opportunities and platforms that organizations, not just the United Nations, but organizations that work with or work on the United Nations are providing young people. So I'd encourage and try to get involved, because these are often concrete avenues and mechanisms for you to be a part of the conversation. And then the second thing, being armed with the knowledge of what is already out there. I think there are 90 opportunities there for young people to be a part of the conversation. Think about what these recommendations mean for our generation, for those of us that are growing up to take over worlds that are not entirely perfect. And think about what it means, what needs to happen today for you to have a more successful tomorrow. And when we start thinking along those lines, we're able to start fleshing out these recommendations a little more. Again, these are seeds for thought, and the thought needs to come from civil society, not just member states. And young people really have the opportunity to be a part of that thought process.
Okay, thank you very much. I think the name of the summit is very interesting. It's not Summit for the Future, but it's Summit of the Future, right? So, which means, in my understanding, the youth should be the main participants of this summit. Not all diplomats talking about what we can do for youth, but we need to discuss how the youth themselves can lead the process for change. I believe this is the spirit of the name, Summit of the Future. Okay, let's go to the Denisa. You have also 2 minutes, please.
Thank you so much, Anselmo. So actually, I would like to highlight a little bit about the common but differentiated responsibility. I think this is very interesting. A term in the context of multilateralisms, which in my personal opinion, I think that common but differentiated responsibility are also applicable in the context of peace, even we actually already implemented that terms, but unfortunately we need to strengthen the applications, because we recognize that there are several points in the context of common but responsibility that we need to highlight. All of the people or all of the countries have the responsibility to maintain peace, but not all of countries have the capability to do so. Even like some countries are stronger than the other countries in the context of military, for example. So that's why I think that we need to strengthen, and I think OCA report could be the main tool to make it like UN more relevant in the context of United Nations Security Council, since the countries in the United Nations Security Council play a very important role in the context of maintaining peace. And in the context of young people, since I'm also currently working in NGO, it's actually a national NGO focusing on sustainable development goals. We actively involving young people in our process. For example, we're creating a guideline for youth to support implementation of sustainable development goals in the local level, because I think it is very critical to ensuring that SDGs could also be implemented in the local level, not only in national or international level. And the second one, we actually create a lot of events involving youth, for example, in Human Rights Festival. So we created annual Human Rights Festival in Indonesia by promoting regions who actively implement human rights principle in their governance. So we usually have youth fellowship as well. So we involving young people and collaborate actively with young people in the regions. So in the context of the summit itself, I think it's very critical for us to inform a lot of young people, because even right now information is a privilege. Not all of people get the information in the context of summit itself. So I think it's very critical for young people and member states to promote the importance role of young people and promote the information, so all people, especially young people, could also actively implement and prepare to come to the event and also contribute actively to the event. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Denisa. You know, this is the fourth PyeongChang Peace Forum. The first one was 2019. That time, over 100 civil society participants all over the world gathered here in this convention center. And the second year, number has reduced by half because of coronavirus. And the last year, this year, none from abroad, you know. But nevertheless, there was some civil society and youth from Korea, and also, you know, the students from abroad studying in South Korea. I hope next year we can have really face-to-face meeting to discuss how to prepare for Summit of the Youth. As we did 3 years ago, we had Fabrizio from UN, the Assistant Secretary. He came to PyeongChang to have a global civil society dialogue for the first time on 75th anniversary. You know? Since then, we continue this type of global dialogue outside of New York. So whenever there's a UN meeting, there's a tendency, oh, those are people around the New York or Geneva. But we need to unpack UN agenda so that ordinary students, especially Global South, it can be Asia, Africa, Latin America, can also participate virtually and also physically. So PyeongChang is the venue for your physical participation in this global civil society dialogue. You know, from the YPC Youth Peace Challenge, I learned a lot from youth, and one of the youth said, youth today or MG generation is the first generation to end poverty and the last generation to solve climate crisis. You know, so some of you are so-called belong to youth, and then I believe you can play the more proactive role. In fact, tomorrow, 3 o'clock in this room, there will be an important session, the youth session on OCA report, the peace, and SDG. We discussed a little bit in this agenda, but we will have a more in-depth discussion in this room. So you are most welcome to join the session tomorrow, 3 o'clock in this room. Once again, thank you all the panelists from different time zones for your contribution and then input, and also all the participants and also interpreters and organizers of this forum. Let's give a big hands to everybody. Thank you. Okay, see you. Bye-bye. Thank you.